All right, I need to get something out of the way really quick. Where's Dana? Oh, there's Dana. Dana, so just from last week, just so you know, as soon as there you go. So I feel like when that picture was taken, I had just been read The Little Prince. So thank you for giving me a hard time last week. I went and found a picture. Now, the second thing is, I'm pretty happy about today's heat for the first time, because you guys know what today is. It's National Hot Dog Day. So, driving around lunchtime today, I thought, well, I'm just going to cook my lunch. Had the buns in the back and the Vienna beef hot dogs on the antenna. So there you go. I'm not unhappy about the heat. All right, enough of that. I'm going to introduce Alex Johnson from the church to welcome us and pray. And she's going to give the microphone to Richard, who will introduce our speaker. And then, as always, I will see you back at the end. Oh, by the way, I'm David Rejebian.
Well, hello. It is wonderful to see all of you here this evening. On behalf of everyone here at Highland Park United Methodist Church, we are so grateful to be spending our evening with you. My name, as David said, is Alex Johnston. I am the Director of Discipleship and Spiritual Formation here at Highland Park United Methodist Church. I've been here 9 years this summer, and I am just so blessed to be a part of this amazing community. I want to take a moment, if you'll join me, and just say thank you to everyone who made this evening possible as part of our 67th season of Rejebian. So will you join me in just a round of applause for Richard, for the Rejebian family, for Jackson Harkey, and all of the volunteers who make this possible. I know that I'm not alone in having a place like this to go away from the heat. That's a pretty big deal. So we are grateful for it. In just a moment, Richard is going to come up and tell us about our incredible speaker for this evening. But before then, will you just join me in a word of prayer? God, again, we thank you for a place like this to gather together, to meet with friends that we've known for years, and to meet new friends. God, thank you that you bring all of us together from different walks of life, from different experiences. God, would you just bless this evening? Would you bless all those who are gathered here today? Thank you for the wonderful food that we were able to enjoy. Thank you for the wisdom. And thank you that you are a God who just loves fun and good conversation and intellectual stimulation. God, we thank you that this church exists to be a place where all of these things can happen. So would you continue to bless this church and bless again all of those who are gathered here. In the name of Jesus we pray, amen.
Did they? All right, Marjorie Herrera Lewis is one of Dallas and Fort Worth, North Texas, pioneering female sports writers. She was the first female beat writer for the Dallas Cowboys, and after that, she did all things NFL. She was with the Fort Worth newspaper then, with the Star Telegram. Later, she, for the Dallas Morning News, was all things NFL. And so she teaches media ethics at the University of North Texas. She basically has won so many awards with this book, including Pencraft and American fiction group. But long and short is she also got Best Book from Newsweek and from Sports Illustrated. This movie has been optioned.
Now, it was several years ago on this stage that we introduced David Grand with Killers of the Flower Moon, and at that time it had just been optioned, and it soon will be in theaters. So we're hoping you get the same treatment over the years with that. But she does with Scott Murray and with Marty Schneider. She does Journeys Through Sports and Life on Sports Map Radio. Incidentally, you can look anywhere you get your podcasts and you can hear that. So they do these sports stories, sports biographies all the time. This book is truly a winner, and we're so glad to have her. And I do want to mention, before we go any farther, that basically upstairs in Terabang has copies to buy. I think they're like $15 or $16 a piece. It's not that expensive. And right after this, I'm going to grab her and take her up so you can see her up at the signing table, because she will sign and personalize those books if you buy them at Terabang. Before we go any farther, perhaps this video will tell you what you need to know before I introduce Marjorie.
I have been thrilled by the response. When Sports Illustrated named it the best novel of 2018, I just about fainted.
You have a new book coming out that
Yes.
a lot of us could learn a lot from.
When the Men Were Gone is a novel based on a true story of a woman who coached football in Brownwood, Texas during World War II.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah, incredible woman. We've already optioned the film rights as well, and the book is doing really well. So I'm excited. Her name was Tylene Wilson. I've always thought of myself as a storyteller. Whether I'm telling the story in print or if I'm speaking it to someone, I love to tell stories. When someone picks up a book that I've written, I hope that they go on a journey with me. I hope that they feel like they are in the story themselves, that they feel like in this book, for example, I want them to feel like they're in Brownwood in the 1940s. What was happening in Brownwood at that time? President Roosevelt had brought in Camp Bowie for German soldiers. He had also converted their airport into an army airfield for them. A lot of things that were happening in Brownwood reflected what was happening around the country. One thing that I did once I knew I was going to write the story in first person was I decided to, in a sense, become an actress, sort of become Tylene. And I ended up, instead of writing during the day, I ended up writing at night. I would sit at my computer about midnight at the kitchen table, and I would put on a Brownwood leather jacket and put a picture of the real Tylene next to my computer, and I would just tell the readers what Tylene would tell us. Well, I became a football coach because I was inspired by Tylene. And as I researched her life and started writing the novel about her, I just thought, you know, over the years, I've been a student of the game. I've acquired the knowledge that I think I could help somebody. When you look at the story, what she was trying to do is keep the football going and not just every bit of the town coming together would be for the war effort. They needed something else. They needed to keep their mind off of the war at least for 3 hours on a Friday night. The town come together and celebrate something, the sense of community. Oh, I think Tylene was an incredible inspiration at her time, and her legacy can continue. She can be an inspiration for generations to come.
Please welcome Marjorie Herrera Lewis.
Thank you so much, Richard. Appreciate it. Okay, is my mic on? Oh, there it is. Jackson, you're the best. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining me here tonight. I have to tell you a little bit of background first before I go into the story. I was 12 years old when my father and mother brought me to Dallas for the first time. And my father was a dentist. I grew up I was born and raised in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Maybe a lot of you have been there, hopefully. And we were on our way to New Orleans for a dental conference. And we stopped in Dallas, and it didn't take me long to realize something about Dallas and about Texas. I turned to my parents at one point and I said, when I grow up, I'm moving here. Because I said, when I'm here, I feel like I'm among the friendliest people I have ever met in my life. So what happens, I go back, I was 12 years old, I go back to Santa Fe, I go off to college at Arizona State University, I graduate, and then I'm on the phone with my mom, and she says, so are you coming back to Santa Fe? And I said, well, Mom, remember I told you I'm moving to Dallas. I said, remember when I was 12, I told you that. And there's this pause on the phone, and then all of a sudden I hear, but you were 12. And I'm like, well, no, that's what I'm going to do. So Mom and Dad flew me from Arizona out here into Love Field. I spent a weekend here, and then I said, that's it. I'm coming to Dallas. So about 2 weeks later, my sister and I, my older sister Judy, and I got my car. We filled up the glove box with everything I owned. And we come out here. I get an apartment. Now, in those days, you had to wait for your rental furniture to arrive. So I'm in my apartment with a cot that I bought at the JCPenney. I'm in my apartment lying on this green plank of a cot with one blanket over me, alone in a town where I knew no one, and I'm staring at the ceiling, and I'm going, okay, God, why am I here? What happened then tonight when my husband and I drove up and we saw the parking lot full of cars, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, people are here to hear me talk. This girl from Santa Fe who decided to come here when she was 12, and this audience, this auditorium is practically full. And I just said, I have made the best decision of my life when I was 12, and I'm so glad that I'm here, and thank you so much for coming to listen to me speak. Oh, it has been quite the journey. So what I'd like to talk about tonight, I'm not really a podium person, especially because I teach at a university, and I use my hands a lot when I talk, and my students are always going like this. You know, they're like, we have bets on who you're going to smack first by mistake. But what I'd like to talk about in the next 50 minutes is my background and why this 1940s helmet, why I decided to write Tylene's story. So we're going to go into my background, a little bit things that I experienced and why I couldn't have written this story when I was in my 20s. Lessons I had to learn in life along the way. And then I want to tell you about the story, how I got the story, how I found out about Tylene, how I wrote the story, and what's come since then. Does that sound good? Okay. So as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the second of 5 children, and I grew up loving sports. Now, if you met my parents, my father played high school baseball, football, and basketball, and when he went off to St. Mary's College of California up in the Northern California Bay Area, he was a pitcher on the baseball team. My mother, she played every sport available to girls at the time. Now, they went to high school in the 40s, so there weren't a lot of things available to her, but as she got older, she became an excellent golfer and bowler and everything that she could get her hands on. So that love was put on, I absorbed that love of sports. Now, I was doing a radio in WBAP one time, and the guy asked me, how does your father feel about you being a sports writer and covering the Dallas Cowboys? And this is true. I told him, if my parents had their way, I wouldn't be a sports writer. I would be pitching for the Cubs. Okay. My dad went to dental school at Northwestern University, so he became a Cubs fan during his time in Chicago. And that's true. So my parents, they passed that love of sports on to me, and I became just so tunnel vision when it came to sports. And then over the years, I discovered that I had two major loves. One was writing. My sister Angela is out here somewhere, and I used to say on rainy days, Ange, let's go in our bedroom and write stories, and we'll ask Mom who is better. And my mom was very tactful. Of course, Ange, every night before we went to bed, I would count my baseballs, and she would count her money. And so when Mom would say to us, your stories are just the same, I'm thinking, well, what kind of future do I have if I'm just as good as a banker? But she always kept everything equal for everybody. So I grew up loving sports, loving to write, and eventually I went to Arizona State. I majored in broadcast journalism, but once I got to Dallas, I decided while I was here to go to SMU and take some print journalism courses. So that's what I did. Any of you may know David McCann. He was my professor. I learned so much from him as a journalism print student at SMU, and that's what launched me into eventually becoming a sports writer. So this is what happened then. After having worked for a couple of small newspapers, including sports editor one year at the Kilgore News-Herald, that was quite an experience because I got to cover so many things. I was never home. In fact, at one point when I was covering the Cowboys, some neighbor tells my husband, he's out working on the yard, and some neighbor comes up and says, I have the perfect woman for you, my friend, she's coming to town. And he says, I have a wife. And she goes, you've been living here for 5 years and we've never seen a wife. I was gone a lot. And so it started with the News-Herald, with the Kilgore News-Herald, with the basketball and Kilgore, with the high school and then Kilgore College. And then it went on to my years with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So here's the deal, though. And I know a lot of you have probably worked in areas where women aren't really that usually in that field. So here we are in 1984, and I get hired by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Up to that time, they had never hired a woman sports writer before. Never. 84. It doesn't seem that long to me. I don't know. But 1984, I was hired, the first woman specifically to be a sports writer. Not the first one in the department, but specifically to be a sports writer. And after I was hired, I had a conversation with my sports editor, which I thought was really interesting. It was the first day that I went to work, and he and I were sitting down, and he said, I want to ask you something. If you're ever put on the Dallas Cowboys beat, how would you cover the beat? And I looked at him and I said, well, I would cover it the way I did the kids at Kilgore College and Kilgore High School. I would always keep in mind that they are people. They're not just products that I cover. They are human beings. And he looked at me in the eyes and he said, you will never make it in this business. I wasn't sure how to take that, but I didn't do anything differently. So 2 years later, a new sports editor came in, and he actually did put me on the Dallas Cowboys beat, which no woman had ever been in any news entity put on a Dallas Cowboys beat. So I was a little bit surprised because, again, it had never happened before. So let me give you an experience that I had to know before I could write about Tylene Wilson. And it wasn't a pleasant experience at the time, but I'm grateful for it looking back now. But what happened was, just picture this. I'm at training camp with the Dallas Cowboys, okay, 1986. Now, I had been on the beat for a while, so I had gone to different, mini camps and the sort, and I had already gotten to know a lot of the players that were the stars. So by then, before they got to training camp, I already knew Tony Dorsett, Herschel Walker, Too Tall Jones, Randy White, Danny White, all those guys. But it's my first week at training camp, and that's the week that the rookies and free agents come in. Okay, so no one knew me. So I'm at practice, and I'm taking notes the first day. Who looks like they might have a chance to make the team? Who looks like they're in over their heads? I'm going to write some notes about what it looks like with these guys. Well, practice ended, and I'm walking to my workstation out at Thousand Oaks. They were out at Cal Lutheran College, now university. So I'm walking over to my workstation, and have any of you imagine this? You've probably heard it. The sound of cleats on cement. Okay, you could hear that clicking sound. Well, I heard it, and it was coming from behind me, and I only heard one set of cleats. So I stopped. I figured somebody's trying to catch up with me. So I stopped and waited, and then I looked to my left, and this rookie, he was a free agent trying to make the team. He comes to my left, he stops a little bit in front of me, turns around, looks me in the eyes, and he says, "You don't belong here." Well, you know, you're a woman in a man's world, you have to think fast. So I looked at him and I said, "Well, I just watched you practice, and I'm going to be here a lot longer than you are." He was cut the next day, and I never saw him again. Yeah. Okay, but I had to know that. I had to experience that, even though in that moment I was like, "Oh, goodness, you know, this is pretty rough." And then, of course, but I had to know that, because imagine Tylene, as I find out her story later, as a football coach in the 1940s. I'm experienced pushback as a writer in the 1980s. Okay, so can you just imagine what it must have been like for her? And we also have to keep in mind the fact that, yes, a lot of women were stepping up and doing a lot of things that the men weren't doing during the war because the men were gone. But a lot of things that we hear about always are the Rosie the Riveters, right? Well, where are the Rosies working? They're doing incredible, majorly important work, but they're in a factory, right? You have to think about Tylene and how people may have responded to her, because she wasn't in a factory. She was in the largest gathering place in any small town. That's the football field. And she's there roaming the sidelines. And she's probably the face of Brownwood, even more so than the mayor, right? Because everybody's there, everybody sees her. So it was a different reaction. I've gotten questions like that over the years as I've spoken. You know, yes, women have done a lot of things, but it was a different situation with her in the public eye. So let me tell you another story, and then we're going to transition a little. So I'm with the Cowboys. Now that story with that one athlete was a negative story that I had to experience. Tom Landry, he was wonderful. And years later, maybe just about 2 years ago, Timmy Newsome, who was a fullback, blocked for Tony Dorsett and Herschel, Timmy Newsome told me, unbeknownst to me the whole time I was covering the team, that when I got put on the beat, Tom Landry called a team meeting and spoke about me for 15 minutes, telling everybody, "We are going to be professional. We are going to wear clothes. We are not going to have any embarrassing situations." And from one day to the next, at the time, I did notice that my first venture into the locker room at Valley Ranch, everything was pretty open. The next day I went, curtains and signs and everything was there. They were everywhere. So I thought, I wonder how much I cost the organization by showing up here. And he even had the guys come out of the shower area. They had shorts that they had to pick up before they left the shower area. It was so professional. There were no embarrassing situations for anybody. And it was a great time to cover the team. So I want to tell you two little stories, too, that will tell you how professional it was and why I'm grateful that I didn't listen to that sports editor who told me I would never make it. What happened? Now, do you remember in 1986, the Cowboys went to London? It was the first time that the NFL was played in London. The Cowboys were playing the Bears, who had just come off a Super Bowl championship. And so I got sent to London to cover the Cowboys. This is how the team treated me. This is what I felt like I had worked hard and how I was perceived. So again, I would never walk into the locker room. When I walked in, everybody was they were still dressed or always had some clothes on. So they wouldn't get in the showers until after I left. So I get to London, and it was the first time the NFL had played there, so there were newspapers from all over the country covering this NFL exhibition game. And everybody's streaming in with their credentials around their neck. Everybody's guys. And the London, the British Bobby, the police officer, is standing at the entrance to the building, which would lead to the locker room, and he's looking at everybody and going like this, and then I come up, and he sees my credential, and he goes, "You can't go in there." And I said, what? He goes, you can't go in there. And I said, oh my gosh, the paper sent me. They're spending all this money for me to be here. I've got to get quotes. I got to cover. I don't care what the paper did. He's you're not going in there. So I'm outside. In the meantime, he's letting everybody streaming in. And I'm pacing. What am I going to do? I'm not going to get any information. I'm not going to talk to anybody. Tom Landry walks out and he goes, Marjorie, why aren't you inside? And I said, he won't let me in. And so Tom Landry walks over to the British Bobby and he says, it's okay for her to go in. She's one of us. And I thought, ooh, I wish I got that paycheck, but okay. So what happens next? The British Bobby looks at Tom Landry, our Tom Landry, and says, she may be one of you in the United States. She is not one of you here. And Tom had to go back in. There were reporters, filling the room. He needed to go back. So he goes back in, and I'm still there. Well, I don't know if you all remember, but Mike Renfro, a receiver that had played football at TCU, had been with the Oilers, and he comes to the Cowboys. He comes out, and he says, Marjorie, what's going on? And I told him again, they won't let me. And he said, who do you need to talk to? So I said, well, how about, Randy White and Tony Dorsett? And I gave him a list. He pulls all those guys out of the locker room, brings them out to me outside. Now, not only do I not have to elbow and elbow with everybody in the locker room, but now I get private interviews. So the guys come out, they answer everything. Mike had stayed there. He looked over my shoulder and he said, the Bears are getting in their bus. Who do you need to talk to from the Bears? So I said, well, how about, Walter Payton, Refrigerator Perry? I just give him a list of people. Mike goes on the opposing team's bus and gets those guys out and brings them to me. Mm-hmm. So here's the deal, though. That was the year the Cowboys did not have a winning season for the first time in 21 years. So I had to write hard stories. But they all felt like I wrote those stories, always keeping in mind that they were human beings, even though they were very hard stories. Because the team, those guys were getting to where they weren't going to have much more playing time. If you remember, Tony he got supplanted by Herschel, didn't even play, in some of the games at all. And they still treated me respectfully. So these are some lessons that I had to learn. So now let's go to Tylene. Having learned this, now I'm in my allergy doctor appointment, and the nurse that's testing me for my allergies says to me, I was wearing a T-shirt. Now, I know this is SMU territory, but my daughter went to the University of Tulsa. Okay. And I was wearing a T-shirt that said, the University of Tulsa football. I had been going to seeing this nurse for 20-some years, but I had never worn a T-shirt until that day. She looked at me and she said, you love football? And I said, yes, I do. This was 2011. And she said, so do I. All the women in my family love football because my great aunt was a football coach. And I just about hyperventilated, okay? She didn't know she was talking to journalists. And so I started asking her all these questions. She figured out I was a journalist. I started asking her all these questions. When was your great aunt a football coach? And she said, during World War II. And then I'm like, where? And she says, Brownwood, Texas. Now, if you follow high school football, your first thought might have been the same thing mine was. Gordon Wood won 7 state championships while he was at Brownwood. I'm thinking, this is one of the iconic football cities in Texas. And so I sat down, started asking her questions. The other nurse finally comes over and she said, I'll take the rest of your patients. Yeah. She's like, that's okay. I've heard about Aunt Tylene before, and you go for it. So by the time I left that appointment, Jean Van Waters had agreed that I would write Tylene's biography. And I was thrilled. I couldn't believe it. I always wanted to write a book, but never just for the sake of writing it. It had to be something that really pulled my heart into it. And I felt like, wow, this has really got me. So I started doing research. My husband, Chuck, he and I would go to Brownwood. Now, if any of you are from a small town, like maybe the size of Brownwood, you probably know that a lot of these small towns have like a local historian that says, well, I knew your mom, and I knew your grandma, and I knew and knew everybody for generations. Well, they have a wonderful, wonderful historian in Brownwood. His name is Dallas Houston. Okay, yes. Wonderful, wonderful guy. His wife, Linda, has a great sense of humor. She told me once, just to change it up, she calls him Waco Waxahachie. Okay. So I am thrilled that I am here now working with Dallas helping me out. So there was this one day, the first time we went out, Dallas joined us at the library at Brownwood High School. And there were a couple librarians that were assigned to work with us. And it was the easiest research I've ever done in my entire life. I just would say, I need this, and the librarians would go get it. You know, I didn't have to do the digging and all that myself. I just told them what I wanted. So Dallas was there, and everybody, I'd look at yearbooks, I'd look at newspaper articles, I'd look at all this stuff, and Dallas would say, they're still in town, I know how you can reach them, I know. And then Dallas went and got the 1950 44 telephone book, and looked up Tylene's address. So Chuck and I drove over by Tylene's house. And it was just a wonderful experience. The school, the university, Howard Payne University, because Tylene coached not only at the high school level, but she coached at the middle school. The only picture we have is with her middle school team. She also coached at Daniel Baker College, which no longer exists. It was consumed by Howard Payne University. So Howard Payne, the local library, the genealogy society, the newspaper archive, everybody in town was fantastic. But here's the thing, as you know, the book says here, it's a novel. So what happened? Well, the story I discovered was lost to time. And that was heartbreaking for me, but let me digress a little bit and tell you why I wasn't surprised. So Tylene inspired me, as you saw in the video, to coach at Texas Wesleyan University. I was the only woman. A couple of reporters had called me and told me that I was the only woman coaching football at any level of college football at that time. But what happened? There was a videographer that was doing a documentary. He never interviewed me. He never got video of me working drills with the kids or anything like that. And this was 2017, and my story is already lost to time. Okay, so here's another parallel. I could understand why Tylene's was, because it was the 1940s. And again, if we remember, a lot of things were not public. Newspapers weren't always publishing. You know, there were a lot of things going on to kind of keep things, all the materials and things used for the war effort. So my husband comes home, and I'm sitting at the kitchen table, and he says to me, you know, what's up? I said, well, I don't have enough information to tell Tylene's story. I can't write a biography. I don't have enough. In fact, even one time I asked the principal at Brownwood High School what was her record, and he said specifically her record in those years, we don't know, because there was a records fire in 1960, and that all went up to flames. So there were so many dead ends. You could go on the internet now and look up Brownwood's record for these years, and you'll have a record, but I don't know what games are attributed to Tylene. So I decided then that I told Chuck, I said, the only way that I'm going to be able to tell the world Tylene's story is to write a novel. Take everything that I know to be true and then create a story around it so that we can still memorialize what she had done and the world will still get to know Tylene. So that's what I ended up doing. But here's the catch. I have been a journalist my whole life. I don't know how to write a novel. How do you write a novel? You know, everybody tells me, oh, you're a writer. You can just figure it out. And I'm like, well, that's like telling me, you know, you're a writer, so go write music. You can do it. No, there are different kinds of writing. And because Tylene was a real person, I felt a ethical obligation to her legacy to give it the best I could. And I didn't think winging it would be the best I could. I wing a lot of things, but I didn't think I didn't want to wing it in her life. So I went back to college and I got a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing Fiction. And when Jean Van Waters found out about it, you know, she's like, oh my gosh, not only are you writing my aunt's story, but now you're paying tuition. And I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. We're good. So that's how I did it. I studied with a lot of really incredible authors, but the program was in the Northeast, and I realized shortly after getting there that these like Northeasterners don't get Texas football. I'm like, wait a minute, maybe I made a mistake. But then one professor came up to me and she said, I was born in Nashville, I went to Auburn, and I get it. So she became my lead professor through the whole program, 60 credit hours, lots of homework, but at least I got to write Tylene's story. So that's how that I started to write the story. I wrote the story originally in third person, but then I had an entry in there that included a diary entry in first person, and my professor said, that's the voice you need to use. So switch to first person. So here's the deal. I switched to first person. As you saw in that video, I wrote in the middle of the night. So I would put on a Brownwood letter jacket. Yep. I'd put a picture of the real Tylene to my left, coffee mug to keep me going all night to my right. And then I would transport myself to the 1940s by listening to 1940s music. So here we go. So. I'll do a typewriter, it's more visual, okay? Okay, then. Okay. And then every now and then. Okay. So I transported myself to the 1940s, and then 6 o'clock would come around. I'd go outside and get the newspaper, and I'd take a look at it, and it'd say, 2015. And I'm like, no way. No way was it 2015. I could not believe we had gotten there so fast because I was just in 1944. So it took a little getting used to. So I had completely, seriously gone back into, I'll put it backward now, it's easier, gone into the 40s in the middle of the night, and I would just tell people what Tylene would tell us. That's what I would write. So here, let me read an excerpt. So I pull out my computer. Here's one thing that Tylene told us that night that I just reenacted with a fake typewriter. Here we go. This is Tylene sitting at her kitchen table thinking about coaching football and why it meant something to her. She says, thinking to herself, every road in Texas leads to a football field. You pass one by, and you'd swear you could smell the leather of a well-worn helmet. You sit in the stands alone at dusk, stare at the field, and you can see the footprint of every football player who ever suited up. Some so quick, they left defenders in their stocking feet. Little kids grow up watching their favorite high school team and go to bed at night dreaming of their turn to play. That was one of the things that meant so much to Tylene. Now, the way that I created the story was based on a lot of true things. Tylene did not have children, but her niece told me that she and her husband John often said, we wish we could have had children. So for some reason, it wasn't meant to be. So she became a teacher, and those kids became her children. And now she's faced with kids that are willing to go off to war because they might not have football that year. There were no men there to coach the team. Now, if you remember, during World War II, a lot of the kids that served during the war would either go to sign up and lie about their age, or they would have their parents agree and sign off that they could go younger. So for a 16 or 17-year-old to want to go off to war and fight in World War II, Tylene thought, wait a minute, I want them to do what men do, but right now they're still boys and they should do what boys do. And there's a backstory in there where she had a child that did not live past the first day of birth. So she knew she couldn't bring her own child through childhood, but she wanted to bring these other children through their childhood. And so she didn't want them going off to war until it was their turn. And so that's why she wanted to coach the team. But nobody wanted her because what does a woman know about football? Okay, now let me tell you this. I worked with a lot of men sports writers who never played football. I figured they learned it because they were a student of the game, because that's how I learned it. But for some reason, they were getting a pass, and I wasn't. And so I've always told people, well, but I'm a student of the game, just as much as anybody else. In fact, when I was coaching at Texas Wesleyan, I used to like to remind my colleagues, the coaches, that they never played in the Super Bowl. Not one of those coaches played in the Super Bowl. But when I was in college, my sorority won the all-university flag football championship, and that was the highest level for girls at the time. So I won at the highest level, and they did not. So we always got a kick out of that. But Tylene, this book, now, of course, you could see I've got the football here. So we know that this story has something to do with football, of course. We've got the helmet, and the way it looks, we can imagine that it's probably the 1940s. The leather jacket that won't stay on the chair. But, let me try again. But the book is much more than football. Football is like the reason that I told her story. But this book is a beautiful reflection of a father-daughter relationship. Tylene's father, and I had to make up some things, because when you write a novel, you have to fill in these holes that you don't have to fill in when you have a biography. So when I knew people were going to ask me, why did Tylene and her dad become football? Why did that become a father-daughter thing? And it was true that it was a father-daughter thing, but her niece didn't know why. I didn't know why. So I had to create. Well, many years ago, I had done research on Tom Landry, and I knew Tom Landry had rickets. So I gave Tylene Tom Landry's rickets. And Tylene had to be outdoors to get the sun. So she and her father started throwing the baseball, throwing the football. There's a part in the book where he tells her, when you became an outdoor girl, it's because I'd taken you to a pediatrician in Fort Worth. And the pediatrician said to me, too bad she's not a boy, because then she could be outdoors all the time. And he thought, well, why would I do it any differently? And so Tylene came to love baseball and football. And so that's why she and her father, it became their thing. And they would go to games all over the place. In fact, I have a little prologue here that I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs, and you can see they're youthful. This is 1910. The book is set in 1944, but this is when Tylene was a little girl. And it says here, my father and I climbed into our horse and buggy and began our 3-mile trek. We had prepared for a squall moving through town, but we couldn't have known that the wind and the rain would swirl so heavily that it would nearly toss me from the cart. At one point, my father had to catch me by my wrist to keep me on board. Just as he steadied me, the wind about swept away his cowboy hat. He clutched it, continuing to steer both horses with his left hand while holding his hat firmly on his head with his right. I hunkered down beside my father beneath the comfort and protection of my mother's homemade quilt. You okay under there, Petunia? He shouted. I pulled the cover back a bit, fought the rain from my eyes by squinting up at my father, and assured him all was well. They would go to any measure to be together and to enjoy these trips together to go to these games. So even in rainstorms and all of this, well, you know what? Dad and daughter are going to the football game. So here's some other things. I used some literary license, of course, because I had to. And I set the book in 1944. In reality, Tylene coached from 42 through 46. And she always said she would have continued to coach through the rest of her life, but the men came back. So she couldn't coach anymore. They took all the coaching spots. She lived to be 88. She was born in 1904 and passed away in 1992. I wish I had met her. I had covered events in Brownwood many times over those years and didn't know about her story. I would love to have met her. But why did I set the book in 1944? Because I wanted the book to be more than just her story. I wanted to be a story also that reflected what was going on in the United States at that time. And so by 1944, as you know, the U.S. got into World War II in December of 41. Well, if I had said it in 42, there would not have been, I couldn't show how much that the American people had to sacrifice yet because we hadn't quite gotten there yet. So by setting it in 1944, we could see scout drives where they were collecting aluminum and cardboard and paper and all these things for the war effort. The town would come together and they would have these drives so that they could support the war effort in that way. We had families who had experienced deaths, and I wanted that to show what heartache that we were experiencing at that time. Tylene, her niece, told me that Tylene used to talk about how when the army bicycles would come into town, they were in twos, and they would go to the house to tell somebody that their husband or their father had been killed in the war, that when they'd see the bicycles, no one in town would make eye contact with them, hoping that they wouldn't come up to them. I wanted to capture all of that, and so that's why I moved it to 1944. I felt like there could be more wealth of history by doing so. So I made some changes, and it's interesting when you're doing research, because I've done research all my life. I've always loved research. It's like a little treasure chest for me, treasure hunt. And even as a journalist, you find a little nugget and you feel like you're the only one in the world that knows this, and I can't wait. It's just really exciting. So I have a habit of researching things that I know I'm not going to use, but it gives me more knowledge. For example, I researched newspaper articles that had Tylene quoted when she was a principal. And these articles were published in the 60s and 70s. But I could see her quotes, and I learned how she talked, how she spoke, what things were important to her and things like that. So I got to know her by reading articles I would never use in my story. And one thing that I did is I looked up her parents' obituaries. And I found out that her father had died as a result of injuries he had sustained during the Zephyr tornado that hit Zephyr in 1906. Please don't hold me to that. I can't remember exactly, but it's in the book. I better read my book. But it was, and it hit at the middle of the night. So you can kind of figure that the family was together. That was in Brown County. So I had Tylene experience this tornado. And so there are a lot of things in the book that I included because I found little nuggets of something else that I knew I would never use, but it would lead me to something else. And that's one of the beauties of writing a story, especially historical fiction, because there is so much history and so many things that you can connect to previous times when you find something like an obituary. I talked to the priest, or not priest, I'm sorry, I'm Catholic. I talked to the pastor who did Tylene's funeral. I called him in like 2011. She passed away in 92, and I asked him, do you remember Tylene Wilson? He goes, you know how many people I have done funerals for since 1992? And I'm like, I know, it's just a shot in the dark. And he goes, well, you're right, I do remember her because she was a football coach. So, so you never know. You always have to ask, just go where you think might be a dead end, but you just never know. And that's what I found with the help of Dallas Houston, with the city getting behind the story. So as I was saying, it's more than just a football story. It's a war home front story. It's a wonderful father-daughter story. It's a story about a husband who is very supportive of his wife. Now, Tylene, I got a letter, an email from a millennial who criticized me for writing a story with the woman in a dress, heels, and pearls, and that's why I wore these pearls tonight, because a reader sent them to me, and so I like to wear them for events. But she did. This millennial says, women can wear pants, and she was making judgments based on today. And so I had to tell her, I said, but this is true, I didn't make it up. Tylene did wear heels, she did wear pearls, a string of pearls, and she did wear a dress every time she coached. And so I'm guessing, and HarperCollins on the book, they originally didn't have all those things, but I made sure they had the pearls. But that was the thing. Tylene was very much a woman of her era. She was a woman. She was very much a 1940s woman, but she was also ahead of her time in many ways. But there is a scene in the book where I want to make sure that I'm being accurate to the era and not reflecting the 2000s in this story. So here's a story in the book where Tylene has to get to a coaches meeting, and they had just finished dinner, she and her husband, John. And John's sitting at the kitchen table, and Tylene is doing the dishes. And John keeps looking at her saying, Tylene, I know back roads. I can take you to the meeting. I can get you there faster. You're going to be barely getting there on time, but I know the back roads. I can get you there faster. And she's saying, no, that's okay. Well, what's the difference? He never said, Tylene, let me do the dishes and you just go. Never occurred to him. So he sat there watching her do the dishes, offering to drive her. And then there's another scene when the football coach up in Stephenville says, I'm not going to play a woman. My boys are not playing Powder Puff. And Tylene is like, this is not Powder Puff. She gets in the car. She goes to John's auto repair place. And she tells John, I am going to meet with Rowdy Black, Coach Rowdy Black. Now, I made up names. But and her husband says, what? And she goes, I'm going to go convince him. I'm not going to talk to him on the phone. I'm going to convince him face to face not to cancel the game against my boys. So Tylene tells John, I'm going to be back after supper. So here, and she hands him a piece of paper. This is how you turn on the oven. This is how you warm up the casserole. Okay, so you can see even just in that scene how traditional and how far beyond she was, because she's handing, we know she's doing all the cooking, but she's in her truck heading over to Stephenville to convince a football coach to play her boys. So Tylene was just very much all about these kids. So here's the thing. I have 11 minutes, and I really would like to open for one or two questions. But here's the thing about Tylene. So she is not only, she's born in 1904. She ends up with a bachelor's degree. She gets a master's degree. She does all the graduate school. She's even got a superintendent's certificate. She went to UT to get that. Never became a superintendent, but she did that. And so she was in many ways ahead of her time. But she was also traditional. And the reason why I was very comfortable with her in her dress, heels, and pearls is because not only the fact that it was true, but my guess is that she knew she wasn't going to be a football coach for the next 40 years. She knew she was going to go back to be a teacher and an administrator. And this is the way she wants to be perceived. Okay? This is how they will always see her. And it reminded me of a story that I read about Tom Landry. He did not intend to be a football coach his entire career. He was going to go into insurance. So when he started wearing his fedora and his suit on the sideline, he wanted to look like an insurance man so that when he made the transition, it wasn't a strange transition. Isn't that interesting? Yes. So Tylene was essentially doing the same thing. You'll see if you read the book that there are a lot of different things that I learned as a sports writer that are reflected in the book. For example, here's another thing. Danny White once said that what made him a good quarterback was the fact that he played the piano. Interesting, right? But I use that to describe the quarterback when Tylene's getting ready for the game and tells her boys, he's a good quarterback because he plays the piano. And the boys are laughing at her, what? And she says, imagine this. He can look at the music like you could look at a field. He could do something different with this hand, these feet as the pedals. She said, you're working all these different sides of your brains at once. And that's what Danny Whitehead said. So if any of you have family members that want to be a quarterback, make sure they play the piano. And then the other thing is that I want to mention is there's a scene. I was being interviewed by a radio station in New York, and the guy had already read the book before he called me. And he told me there's a scene in the book. I'm not going to read it now because we're running out of time, but he said there's a scene in the book that they're going to show at the Oscars. I was like, oh, okay, I like it. What scene is that? And he said, there's a scene where the African-American groundskeeper and maintenance man for the high school is doing a dry run at the football field to make sure the night before that the lights are all working and everything, and Tylene is in the stands. And she goes down to talk to Wendell, and when she's getting ready to leave, he whispers her name. He says, Miss Tylene, and she turns around and he says, they're afraid of us. And he says, go get them. And she smiles in solidarity. What I was saying there is that the world was on the brink of change, okay? And even though we still don't have a lot of women in football coaching, a lot of things have changed for women since the 1940s. So that was a scene that I wanted to also portray, that we were on that cusp of change here in the United States. So I'm going to wrap it up with a couple of things. First of all, the book has been optioned to film, and Mandalay Films is on board to produce it. The script was almost ready when the screenwriters went on strike, so yeah. But the producers assured me that it's almost finished, and once the strike is over, it will move pretty quickly, so hopefully. So that's where we are with that. But here are two things that really mean a lot to me. Because of the book, and because Tylene's story had been lost to time, it has now been found. And Gordon Wood Stadium in Brownwood now has a room in the press box called the Tylene Wilson Room. It's got a beautiful plaque and tribute to everything she did for the school district, and including her coaching. And also, the Brown County Museum of History now has an exhibit on Tylene's story. And the thing that I think is just really beautiful in all of this is that when I read stories, newspaper articles of Tylene as a principal, she used to have her students, she would bring in from Fort Worth theater groups and authors to speak to her students. Her area was English. And she wanted them to learn the beauty of reading, the beauty of writing, the beauty of storytelling. And she did that for her students for many, many decades. And now, here we are in 2023, and we're reading about her. And I have spoken to so many students at different levels. I've spoken at Northwestern University, at Arizona State University, at UTA, at grade schools, at high schools in Brownwood and in Jefferson, and all over. And my publisher has sent me to Miami and to New Orleans and to Denver and to Nashville. And I've been all over sharing Tylene's story. And people are reading about her. Now think of the symmetry of that. I just feel like that little piece that I had, when I got told when I was a junior in college that I had allergies, I didn't realize that I was being given a gift. It didn't feel like it when I was really painfully, dealing with my allergies for all those years. But when I wore that t-shirt and met Jean Van Waters and started this incredible journey that I hope will always commemorate Tylene's life and has certainly changed mine, I am just so grateful that she's still encouraging people to read. Only it's now about her. Really, I just can't. So that's how it came to be and what it is. We've got 4 minutes, so if we could, I'm long-winded, as you know, so if my question answers are long, well, thank you.
Okay, we've got one right here. We have time for two.
How did her team do?
Pardon?
The team that she coached, did they win a lot?
Oh, great question. Okay, because this could also be a review, so I can give spoilers. My dad, when he finished reading the book, he looked at me and he said, they're going to win in the movie. And I'm like, okay. Okay. You know what? They didn't win the game. And here's one reason why I didn't have them win the game. We only have one game at the end. The whole story, the book is a journey. We only have one game at the end. People have asked me, why only one game? I'm like, I don't want to repeat myself, okay? Really, the journey was what this is all about. But she wanted to protect the boys, right? She wanted to protect them. So when one of her players gets hurt, they knew, everybody knew, if she put him back in the game, they would win. Because it wasn't, horribly hurt, but enough. And when the quarterback comes to her and says, Miss Tylene, why won't you put him back in the game? She said, why would I? He's hurt. And when they lose the game, the stadium is clapping like you wouldn't believe, and she's going, nobody has ever cheered for a loss. But they finally got it. They finally got it, that what she was doing. And the coach from Stephenville comes up to her and says, I didn't cotton to doing this at the beginning, but I know what would have been if you had put him in. He knew that Tylene would have won the game too, but she was not willing to sacrifice an injured student. Mm-hmm.
For one more question, David gets it.
Thank you. You mentioned the players.
Where are we?
Here we
okay.
are.
Okay.
Did you find any of her players, and if so, what did they tell you?
I found family members. In fact, this young fellow right here, his granddaughter told me that just like the rest of the team, nobody wanted to play for a woman coach. They went to one practice and realized there is nobody else I'd rather play for. So it was hard for me to find the players themselves, but I was lucky enough to get some family members, yes. And one other thing in the story that I really love is that at one point during the game, they ran over to her and they started calling her coach. Yeah, and then we have her thoughts on, oh my gosh, they're calling me coach. There are a lot of tender moments. Okay, anything else?
Well, Mr. Brownwood gets it. Okay, here you go, Rod.
I grew up about 30 miles from Brownwood, a little town called Coleman.
Uh-huh.
There were two sports in Brownwood. One was football, the other one was spring football.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly right. Yes, I love that. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Now, Terabang is upstairs. Marjorie is going to go upstairs. She can sign and personalize these books for you. Next week's our last one. It's Mary Robertson. She's reviewing 3 books by the same author, World War II trilogy. Basically, Mission, the story of Jimmy Stewart flying bombers over Germany during the Second World War. Bombshell, the story of Carol Lombard and her death on a war bond tour, and Dutch Girl, which is the story of a teenaged Audrey Hepburn in the Netherlands during Nazi occupation. So hope to see you next week.